The smell hits you first, a suffocating, humid blend of crushed gardenias, sour sweat masked by heavy French powder, and melting beeswax. When you step into a Mayfair ballroom in a dress older than half the debutantes present, you don't feel like a fairy tale. You feel the draft through the thinned silk at your waist. You feel the eyes. Tonight, Clara wore her desperation like a frayed hem, waiting for the wolves of high society to take their first bite. The carriage ride had been silent, smelling of damp squabs and horsehair. Now, standing at the precipice of the Duke of Richmond's grand ballroom, Clara wanted to vomit. It wasn't a delicate, ladylike fluttering of the stomach. It was a cold, acidic knot sitting just beneath her ribs. She smoothed her gloved hands down the skirts of her gown. The gloves were mended at the thumbs. The gown itself was a tragedy of necessity. It had been a vivid sapphire when her mother wore it 12 years ago. Now, after countless washings, dye attempts, and savage alterations, it was the color of bruised ice. The fabric at the bodice was worn so thin it felt like wet paper against her skin. "Stand up straight, Clara," Aunt Edith hissed, her voice a reedy whisper over the tuning of the orchestra. Edith smelled of camphor and cheap peppermint. "They only stare if you give them a reason to." A lie. They stared because the Hastings were practically destitute, clinging to the edge of the aristocracy with bloody fingernails. Clara stepped forward. The footman announced them. The sound of their names, Miss Clara Hastings, accompanied by Lady Edith Hastings, dropped into the cavernous room and sank without a ripple. No one looked up. No one cared. Until they did. The temperature in the room was unbearable. 400 bodies packed into an unventilated gallery, churning up the heat. Clara navigated the edge of the floor, keeping her back close to the silk-papered walls. She felt the texture of the flocked wallpaper, catching the loose threads of her shawl. A group of women in the corner, clustered like vibrant, poisonous birds, turned their heads. Clara recognized the ringleader, Lady Genevieve. Genevieve wore emerald silk that looked so new it practically crackled. The contrast was a physical blow. Clara looked down at her own skirt. The hem was carefully rolled and stitched by her own hands just hours before, but the fabric was exhausted. It sagged. It held no shape. "Just breathe," Clara told herself. 3 hours. Nod, smile, drink the warm lemonade, and leave. She didn't want a husband. She wanted an investor for her father's failing shipping ledger. She needed one of these overfed, gout-ridden lords to remember that the Hastings name used to mean something in the East India trade. But looking at the sea of faces, she realized the impossibility of it. You do not ask for a loan while wearing a beggar's rags. You only invite contempt. A footman passed with a silver tray. Clara took a glass. The crystal was heavy, cold, grounding. She held it tightly, letting the chill seep through the thin cotton of her mended glove. "I say, is it 1812 again?" The voice was pitched perfectly. Not a shout, but carrying effortlessly over the low hum of the crowd. It belonged to Lord Henry, a man whose only discernible talent was inheriting money and spending it on waistcoats. Clara kept her eyes on the dancers. She took a sip of the drink. It tasted like sugary water and copper. "I believe it is," a woman replied. Genevieve. "Look at the cut of the sleeve. I haven't seen a puff like that since I was in the nursery. Do you suppose she found it in an attic or robbed a crypt?" A ripple of laughter. Sharp. Guttural. Real. Clara's jaw tightened. She didn't flush. Her body went the opposite direction, plunging into an icy, rigid stillness. The silk of her dress, already clinging to her damp skin, suddenly felt like a shroud. She wanted to turn and scream at them. She wanted to throw the sticky lemonade into Henry's stupid, powdered face. Instead, she stood there. She took another sip. She was a Hastings. They were broke, not broken. But the isolation was absolute. The crowd seemed to physically recede, leaving a hollow sphere around her and Aunt Edith. Edith was pretending to be deeply fascinated by a stucco cherub on the ceiling, her jaw trembling slightly. That made Clara angrier than the insults, the cowardly acceptance of it. The musicians struck up a waltz. The floor swelled with movement. Clara remained anchored to the wall, feeling every draft, every sideways glance, every whispered calculation of her worth. She was a zero, less than zero. She was an eyesore in their perfect, curated world. An hour passed. It felt like a geological era. The room grew louder, the laughter looser as the champagne flowed. Clara's feet ached. The soles of her slippers were paper thin, and the polished oak floor was unforgiving. She needed air. The scent of bodies and decaying floral arrangements was making her dizzy. "I am going to the terrace," Clara murmured to Edith. "Don't draw attention," Edith muttered back, not looking at her. Clara pushed away from the wall. She had to cross a corner of the dance floor to reach the French doors. She timed it, waiting for a gap between the swirling couples. She stepped out. She didn't see Genevieve's foot. It wasn't a clumsy accident. It was a deliberate, precise strike, an ankle hooked just as Clara shifted her weight. Clara pitched forward. She didn't fall entirely to the ground. She caught herself on a marble pillar, the rough stone biting into her palms, tearing the skin through the mended glove. The lemonade glass shattered on the floor, the sound exploding like a gunshot over the violins. But the glass wasn't the worst sound. As she lurched, a dancer in a heavy velvet coat stepped backward, his heel coming down hard on the frayed hem of Clara's dress. She tried to pull away. The exhausted 12-year-old Silk gave up. "Rape!" The sound was shockingly loud. It wasn't a delicate tear. It was a violent, jagged parting of fabric. The seam at her waist gave way, tearing straight up the side of her bodice. The icy blue silk peeled back, exposing the yellowed cotton chemise beneath and the rigid, unglamorous boning of her corset. The music didn't stop, but the immediate vicinity froze. Clara hung there, clutching the pillar, the cold air hitting her exposed side. She didn't cry. The humiliation was too vast for tears. It felt like being submerged in boiling water. A dull thud vibrated in her jaw, her pulse betraying her. Her ears rang. Her vision narrowed to the shattered crystal on the floor and a puddle of sticky liquid seeping into the oak. "Oh dear," Genevieve said. Her voice dripped with saccharine horror. "The poor thing is falling apart. Literally." A man laughed, a wet, snorting sound. Clara forced herself to stand up straight. Her hands were shaking violently. She grabbed the torn flaps of the silk and pulled them together, clutching them at her side in a desperate, white-knuckled grip. She looked up. They were all looking. 50 pairs of eyes glittering with morbid fascination, disgust, and cruel amusement. They were looking at the yellowed chemise. They were looking at her shaking hands. They were looking at poverty, bare and ugly, right in the middle of their gilded cage. She couldn't breathe. Her chest seized. The corset, previously just uncomfortable, was now a vice cracking her ribs. "Walk away," her brain screamed. Just walk. But her legs felt filled with wet sand. If she let go of the fabric to gather her skirts, she would expose herself further. If she stayed, she was a sideshow. "Someone fetch a maid," a dowager muttered loudly, fanning herself aggressively. "This is indecent." Indecent. Not cruel, not unfair. Indecent. Clara's fingernails dug into her own hip, drawing blood through the cotton chemise. She hated them. She hated them with a pure, white-hot ferocity that momentarily burned away the shame. But hatred didn't fix the dress. Hatred didn't get her out of the room. She took a step back, dragging the torn hem across the glass. It made a sickening, scraping noise. Another laugh. She felt like an animal in a pit, surrounded by people poking her with sticks to see if she would bleed. She looked for Aunt Edith, but the woman had vanished, melted into the crowd to avoid the blast radius of Clara's ruin. Clara was entirely, utterly alone. Arthur, Duke of Westford, hated balls. He hated the smell of them. He hated the noise. Most of all, he hated the predators. He was standing by the terrace doors, a glass of untouched whiskey warming in his hand, observing the room with the detached, weary interest of a man watching insects in a jar. He was tired. His bones ached from a recent ride from Yorkshire, and his mind was still on the coal yields of his northern estates. He had watched Clara Hastings all evening, not because she was beautiful, though she possessed a stark, angular sort of strikingness, but because she was so obviously drowning. He recognized the dress, not the specific garment, but the type, the frantic, desperate attempt to preserve dignity when the money was gone. He had watched her take the insults. He had seen the rigid set of her spine. He respected it. It was a hell of a lot more spine than the rest of the sycophants in the room possessed. Then he saw the trip. He saw Genevieve's foot jut out. He saw the fall. He heard the tear. Arthur didn't gasp like the dowagers. He didn't laugh like the young lords. He felt a sudden cold flare of rage. It wasn't a chivalrous knight in shining armor kind of anger. It was a deep guttural disgust at the pack mentality of the ton. They were vultures picking at a wounded bird. He watched Clara clutch her torn bodice. He saw the panic in her eyes, raw and unguarded, quickly suppressed by a brittle, terrifying pride. He set his glass down on a nearby mahogany table. The clack of the crystal was decisive. Arthur didn't rush. He didn't run. He walked. His stride was long and heavy. People moved out of his way, not out of respect, but out of an instinctive animal realization that a larger predator had entered the space. Arthur was a big man, broad-shouldered and unsmiling, wearing a severe black evening coat that smelled faintly of cigar smoke and wet rain. The crowd parted. Clara didn't see him until he was right in front of her. She flinched, pulling the torn fabric tighter against her side, expecting another insult, another jab. Her eyes were wide, the color of a stormy sea, dilated with adrenaline. She looked feral. Arthur didn't look at her torn dress. He didn't look at her exposed chemise. He looked directly into her eyes. "Quite a draft in here," he said. His voice was low, a dark rumble that vibrated under the noise of the room. Before she could process the words, Arthur moved. He didn't ask permission. He didn't make a grand, sweeping gesture. He simply unbuttoned his heavy black broadcloth evening coat, shrugged it off his shoulders, and stepped into her space. He dropped the coat over her. The sensory shift was violent. The coat was massive. It engulfed her. It was heavy, the dense wool instantly pressing down on her shoulders, grounding her shaking frame. The heat of his body was still trapped in the lining. It smelled like cedar, tobacco, and something uniquely masculine, a clean, sharp scent of rain and cold air. It completely covered her shoulders, her arms, and the jagged, humiliating tear at her waist. It fell past her knees. Clara gasped, a small, involuntary sound. She looked up at him, bewildered, the fight temporarily knocked out of her. Arthur stood before her in his waistcoat and shirt sleeves, a severe breach of etiquette in a ballroom. He didn't care. He reached out and gently grasped the lapels of the coat he had just put on her, pulling them slightly closer together to ensure she was entirely covered. His knuckles brushed her collarbone. His hands were warm, calloused, not the hands of a soft lord. "Come along, Miss Hastings," Arthur said quietly. It wasn't a request. Clara stared at him. The room around them had gone deathly silent. The orchestra was still playing, but the voices had ceased. The ton was in shock. The Duke of Westford, a man who famously spoke to no one unless forced, was standing in his shirt sleeves, having just cloaked the laughingstock of the evening. "Where?" Clara whispered. Her voice was cracked, raw. "Anywhere but here," Arthur replied. He offered his arm. Clara looked at the sleeve of his fine white shirt. She looked back at the crowd. Genevieve's mouth was slightly open, her complexion turning a blotchy red. Lord Henry looked as if he had been slapped. A dark, bitter satisfaction flared in Clara's chest. She didn't let go of the coat. She curled her bruised, bleeding fingers into the heavy wool lapels, anchoring herself to it. She placed her hand on Arthur's arm. His muscles were dense beneath the linen, solid, real. Thank you, Your Grace, she managed to say, her voice gaining a fraction of its strength back. Arthur didn't smile, but a muscle feathered at his jaw. Don't thank me yet. I'm taking you to a carriage that smells entirely of wet dogs. He turned, leading her away. They walked right through the center of the crowd. Arthur set a slow, deliberate pace. He didn't look at anyone. He forced them to part, forced them to step back from the girl they had just tried to destroy. Clara kept her head high. The coat was ridiculously large on her. It looked absurd, but it felt like armor. The heavy wool blocked out the draft, blocked out the stairs, blocked out the world. As they reached the doors, Clara heard the whispers start up again behind them, furious and scandalized. She didn't care. The smell of cedar and tobacco filled her lungs, pushing out the scent of decay. She was leaving the wolves behind. The cold air outside the Richmond estate was a physical blow. It smelled of wet soot, horse manure, and the sharp metallic tang of an impending downpour. Clara inhaled it like a drowning woman breaking the surface. Arthur's carriage did not wait in the endless snaking line of crest-emblazoned vehicles. It sat entirely apart, tucked into a shadowy alcove near the mews, guarded by a coachman who looked more like a bare-knuckle boxer than a servant. Arthur opened the door himself. The hinges let out a low, protesting groan. "In," he said. Clara climbed the iron step. The heavy wool of his coat caught around her ankles, and she stumbled, her bare knees knocking hard against the brass doorframe. A sharp bite of pain flared up her leg, but she bit her lip and hauled herself inside. He followed, pulling the door shut behind them. The click of the latch severed the outside world completely. The carriage interior was pitch black, save for the weak yellow slice of light bleeding through the cracked leather window blind. And Arthur had not lied. The enclosed space smelled overwhelmingly of wet dog, specifically damp, unwashed hound, layered over the deep, biting scent of old tobacco and saddle soap. There were no velvet squabs or silk tassels here. The leather seats were cracked and slick. The carriage lurched forward. Clara was thrown back against the squabs. The silence between them was not a comfortable one. It was heavy, vibrating with the unspeakable reality of what had just occurred. The adrenaline that had propelled her through the ballroom, rigid and defiant, was evaporating. In its wake came the crash. Her hands began to shake again. Not a subtle tremor, but a violent, uncontrollable shuddering that rattled her teeth. The cold of the night was seeping through the gaps in the torn silk of her gown, battling the residual heat of the Duke's coat. She hugged her arms across her chest, pulling the heavy broadcloth tighter. Her right hand, scraped raw from the marble pillar, throbbed in time with the rattling wheels on the cobblestones. She could feel the sticky, cooling dampness of her own blood drying against the fine cotton of his coat lining. "You are bleeding." Arthur's voice came from the dark corner opposite her. It was flat, observational, not a question. "It is nothing," Clara lied. Her voice cracked, betraying the tight, suffocating knot in her throat. "I heard the tear," Arthur said. The carriage hit a rut, tossing them slightly. He didn't brace himself. He simply swayed with the brutal motion. "And I saw you catch yourself on the pillar. If you ruin my lining, Miss Hastings, you will owe me a tailor." Clara stared into the shadows, her breath hitching. A sudden hysterical urge to laugh clawed at her throat. He was sitting there in his shirt sleeves, having just committed social suicide to drag a destitute spinster out of a ballroom, and he was threatening her with a tailor's bill. "I apologize, Your Grace," she managed, the sarcasm a brittle, defensive shield. "I shall add it to my family's extensive ledger of debts. It might take a decade to reach the top of the pile." Arthur shifted. The leather creaked under his weight. He leaned forward, catching the thin stripe of street lamp light. His face was a study in hard angles, a strong, unforgiving jaw, a prominent nose, and eyes that were impossibly dark and completely unreadable. There was no pity in them. Thank God. Pity would have broken her. "Why did you just stand there?" he asked. "When?" Before the tear, when they were mocking your gown. You took it like a beaten dog." The words were a slap. Clara's spine snapped straight, the back of her head hitting the wooden paneling of the carriage. The humiliation rushed back, hot and toxic. "I am a Hastings," she snapped, her voice trembling with sudden ferocious anger. "We do not have the luxury of throwing temper tantrums in ballrooms. If I throw a glass at Lord Henry, my father loses his last remaining credit with the bank. I endure it because I have to, because pride is expensive and we are entirely out of funds." "And yet," Arthur murmured, leaning back into the shadows, "when your dress ripped, you looked ready to murder half the room." "I was deciding who to kill first." A low sound emanated from the dark corner. It took Clara a second to realize it was a chuckle. It was a rusty, unused sound, harsh and abrupt. "I would have started with Genevieve," Arthur said. "She has a weak neck." Clara swallowed hard, the fight draining out of her just as quickly as it had flared. She rested her head against the rattling window, watching the blurred, gas-lit streets of London fly past. She was ruined, utterly, completely ruined. Tomorrow, the gossip sheets would have a field day. The beggar Miss Hastings and the half-dressed Duke. "You shouldn't have done it," she whispered. The scent of his coat, cedar, rain, smoke, was intoxicatingly safe, and it made her want to weep. "You should have let me walk out alone. Now they will tear you apart, too." "Let them try," Arthur said. The indifference in his tone was absolute. "I have enough coal in Yorkshire to buy and sell every miserable parasite in that room. Their opinions are entirely irrelevant to me." "They are not irrelevant to me," Clara said softly. "They are my father's creditors." Silence fell over the carriage again, thicker this time. The reality of their deeply unequal world sat between them on the cracked leather floor. He was a duke who could afford to play in his shirt sleeves. She was a woman who couldn't afford a needle to mend her own ruin. The carriage lurched to a halt. It wasn't the smooth, gliding stop of a well-sprung Mayfair rig, but a jarring, bone-rattling halt. Clara looked out the window. The heavy London fog had rolled in, clinging to the damp brickwork of her street. Bloomsbury. It wasn't a slum, but it was a far cry from the glittering terraces of the West End. The houses here were narrow, squeezed tightly together as if for warmth. The carriage door swung open, and the freezing, damp air rushed in. Arthur stepped out first, landing heavily on the uneven cobblestones. He turned and offered his hand. Clara hesitated. She gathered the massive folds of his coat, careful to keep the ruined flaps of her silk gown hidden beneath it. She placed her uninjured left hand in his. His grip was firm, calloused, and shockingly warm against the creeping chill of the night. She stepped down. The street was quiet, save for the distant, mournful howl of a dog and the steady dripping of condensation from the eaves. She turned to face her home, number 14. The paint on the front door, once a proud, glossy black, was blistering and peeling away in graying flakes. The brass knocker was tarnished green. A single, sickly candle flickered in the ground floor window. "Thank you, Your Grace," Clara said, her voice stiff. She wanted to disappear. She wanted him to leave before he noticed the missing roof slates or the crack in the stone steps. She reached for the lapels of the coat, ready to shrug it off. Arthur's hand shot out, his fingers wrapping around her wrist. Not hard, but immovable. "Leave it," he said. Clara looked up at him. The fog was swirling around his broad shoulders. Without his coat, the damp cold had to be seeping through his linen shirt, but he gave no indication of discomfort. He stood planted on the pavement, an immovable object. "I cannot take your coat, Your Grace," Clara said, her jaw tight. "It is highly improper, and I have no servant to return it to you tomorrow." "I don't want it back tomorrow," Arthur said, his voice dropping into a low, rumbling register. He looked at the peeling door, then down at the mended thumbs of her gloves, now stained with a faint smear of red. "The lining is ruined anyway." "I can wash it," Miss Hastings. He cut her off, stepping half a pace closer. The sheer size of him in the dim light was overwhelming. You are freezing. Your dress is torn to the waist. If you take this coat off now, you will catch your death before you find your keys. Keep the damn coat. Clara stared at him. The contradiction of the man was infuriating. He was brutal, blunt, entirely devoid of gentlemanly softness, yet he was standing shivering in the fog so she wouldn't have to. She felt a hot prickle of tears behind her eyes. It was the ultimate humiliation, not the cruelty of the ton, but the unexpected gruff charity of a stranger. It stripped away the last layer of her pride. "Why?" she whispered, the word tearing out of her. "Why did you do it? You don't know me." Arthur looked at her for a long, silent moment. His gaze dropped to her mouth, then back up to her stormy, bloodshot eyes. "Because I despise them," he said simply. "And because for a moment, before you fell, you looked like the only real breathing human being in that entire miserable house." He didn't wait for a reply. He released her wrist, turned on his heel, and strode back to his carriage. "Drive!" he barked at the coachman. Clara stood on the cracked pavement, clutching the heavy wool around her neck. She watched the carriage rattle away, its rear lantern bleeding into the fog like a dying ember. She turned and fumbled with her keys. The lock was stiff and required a vicious jiggle to turn. When she finally pushed the heavy door open, the hallway greeted her with the smell of boiled cabbage and damp floorboards. It was freezing inside, colder somehow than the street. She locked the door behind her and leaned against it, sliding down the splintering wood until she hit the floor. The silence of the empty house pressed in on her. She pulled her knees to her chest, buried her face in the thick wool of the Duke's collar, and finally, silently, began to sob. She wept for her ruined gown, her bleeding hands, her father's ledgers, and the terrifying, heavy warmth of a coat she had no right to wear. Morning came not with a gentle dawn, but with a harsh, gray light that aggressively exposed every flaw in Clara's bedroom. She lay on her back, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked vaguely like the map of India. Her body ached as if she had been beaten with a wooden plank. Her right hand was stiff and wrapped in a makeshift bandage torn from an old linen sheet. Hanging over the back of her single rickety chair was the Duke of Westford's coat. In the sober light of day, it looked even more massive, entirely incongruous with the faded floral wallpaper and the threadbare rug. It was a monolith of wealth. The wool was impossibly fine, the tailoring immaculate. Clara hadn't washed the blood from the lining yet. She couldn't bring herself to touch it. Downstairs, the front door slammed so hard the floorboards vibrated. Clara squeezed her eyes shut. Aunt Edith had returned. Footsteps marched up the stairs, sharp and furious. The bedroom door flew open, hitting the wall with a loud crack. Edith stood in the threshold, still wearing her crumpled evening gown from the night before, a heavy wool shawl wrapped tightly around her thin shoulders. Her face was gray, the rouge standing out in stark, clownish circles on her cheeks. She smelled of stale wine and terror. "You fool!" Edith hissed, stepping into the room and shutting the door behind her. Her voice shook with suppressed rage. "You absolute catastrophic fool." Clara sat up slowly. The cotton of her nightshift pulled against her bruised skin. She didn't say a word. She just looked at her aunt. "I had to stay at the Abernathy's townhouse," Edith ranted, pacing the small strip of floor at the foot of the bed. "I couldn't show my face. They are talking of nothing else, Clara. Nothing else. The Hastings girl, tripping over her own ragged skirts and flashing her undergarments to the entire peerage. And then—" Edith stopped, her eyes landing on the chair. She stared at the black broadcloth coat, as if it were a venomous snake coiled on the upholstery. "Is that—" Edith choked on the words. "Is that Westford's?" "Yes," Clara said. Her voice was scratchy, hollowed out by crying. "You stole his coat." "He gave it to me." "Don't be absurd," Edith shrieked, throwing her hands in the air. "Dukes do not give their coats to bankrupt spinsters. You have ruined us, Clara, utterly." Lord Henry's father holds the note on your father's remaining warehouse. Do you think he will extend grace to the laughingstock of Mayfair? Do you? Lord Henry is a cruel, empty-headed pig, Clara said flatly. Edith lunged forward, her hand raised. Clara didn't flinch. She just stared dead-eyed at her aunt. Edith stopped, her hand trembling in the air, suddenly afraid of the cold, dead expression on her niece's face. I am going to write an apology, Edith stammered, backing away. I will write to Lady Genevieve, and I will hire a boy to return that wretched coat to Westford with a groveling note. We will beg for forgiveness. No, the word was quiet, but it dropped into the room like an anvil. What did you say? Edith breathed. Clara threw off her thin blanket and stood up. The cold air bit at her, but she barely felt it. A cold, hard knot of defiance had calcified in her chest overnight. She was done. She was done shrinking, done apologizing, done bleeding for people who only wanted to watch her bleed. I said no, Clara repeated, stepping toward her aunt. I will not apologize for being poor. I will not apologize to Genevieve for tripping me, and I will not return that coat with a groveling note. You are mad, Edith whispered. Probably, Clara agreed. She walked over to the wash basin and plunged her bare, uninjured hand into the freezing water. Now get out of my room. I have to mend a torn dress. Across the city, in a massive, hushed townhouse overlooking Hyde Park, Arthur sat behind a mahogany desk the size of a billiard table. His study smelled of ink, old paper, and beeswax. The fire was roaring in the grate, driving back the chill of the damp morning. He was fully dressed in severe morning wear, his cravat tied with ruthless precision. His valet, Reynolds, a thin-grained man with an expression of perpetual mild distaste, stood holding a silver tray. The post, Your Grace, Reynolds said. And 3 calling cards from reporters at the Society papers. They are currently loitering on the pavement outside. Arthur didn't look up from the mining report he was annotating. Tell the footman to clear them away. Use the dogs if necessary. Very good, Your Grace. And regarding your evening coat... Arthur's pen paused. He looked up. Reynolds cleared his throat nervously. I assumed you left it at the club, Your Grace. Shall I send a boy to retrieve it? No, Arthur said. He set the pen down. The sharp scratch of the nib ceased, leaving the room heavy with silence. It is not at the club. I left it with Miss Hastings. Reynolds's eyebrows twitched, the only sign of his profound shock. I see. Shall I arrange for a seamstress to visit the Hastings residence, Your Grace? The rumors suggest the young lady's wardrobe suffered a catastrophic failure. Arthur leaned back in his leather chair. He stared at the flames licking the edges of the coal in the grate. He had woken up with a rare pounding headache. He hadn't been drunk last night, but the sheer irrational stupidity of his own actions felt like a hangover. He was a man of logic, ledgers, and calculated risks. He did not engage in theatrical rescues. He did not invite the ravenous gaze of the ton upon his house. But he kept seeing her face, the way her eyes had gone wide, feral and terrified, as the silk tore, the way she had gripped his lapels in the carriage, her scraped knuckles bleeding onto his lining, fighting a silent, agonizing war to keep her composure. He realized now, in the cold light of day, what he had done. He hadn't saved her. He had merely painted a target on her back. By singling her out, by giving her his coat, a deeply intimate, scandalously protective gesture, he had dragged her from the fringes of society's disdain right into the white-hot center of its malice. Genevieve and her ilk wouldn't just laugh at Clara now. They would try to destroy her for daring to catch the attention of a duke. No, Reynolds, Arthur said slowly, his voice dark with a sudden, immovable resolve. Do not send a seamstress. Sir? Arthur stood up. He walked to the window, looking out at the fog rolling off the park. If he left it here, Clara Hastings would be ruined. Her family would be swallowed whole by their debts, and she would be forced into some miserable, squalid existence in the country, or worse. The ton would win. They would break the only spine in London worth a damn. He felt a familiar cold burn in his chest. It was the same stubborn spite that had driven him to triple the output of his failing coal mines when everyone said they were dead. He wasn't going to let them win. "Prepare the carriage, Reynolds," Arthur said, turning back to his valet. His eyes were hard, black flint. "Where to, Your Grace?" "Bloomsbury," Arthur said. "Number 14. I'm going to call upon Miss Hastings." The carriage did not belong in Bloomsbury. It was a monstrous thing of gloss-black lacquer and silver fixtures, drawn by 4 matching grays that snorted plumes of white vapor into the damp morning air. When it pulled onto Clara's street, the neighborhood stopped. A butcher's boy dropped a parcel of suet. A scullery maid paused mid-scrub on a stoop, her lye-reddened hands freezing in the bucket. Inside number 14, Clara was in the kitchen, aggressively scrubbing a burnt skillet with a handful of rough sand. Her right hand was practically useless, the makeshift bandage thick and clumsy. The stinging in her scraped palms was a localized, pulsing rhythm that kept her grounded. It kept her from thinking about the catastrophic ledger book sitting on her father's desk in the study. It kept her from thinking about the heavy black broadcloth coat hanging over her bedroom chair like a sleeping animal. A knock hammered at the front door. It wasn't the polite, rhythmic tap of a neighbor. It was 3 heavy, widely spaced blows that rattled the cheap hinges. Upstairs, a floorboard creaked frantically. Aunt Edith was scurrying for cover. Clara wiped her good hand on her coarse linen apron. She didn't check the hallway mirror. She didn't pinch her cheeks or smooth her hair. She was wearing a faded brown day dress that smelled faintly of old cooking fat, and her hair was yanked back into a severe utilitarian knot. She walked to the door and threw the deadbolt. She pulled the door open. Arthur, Duke of Westford, filled the doorframe. The gray morning light caught the severe angles of his face. He was wearing a dark charcoal morning coat, his cravat tied tight against his throat. He looked immovable. He smelled of rain, sharp citrus soap, and expensive leather. The contrast between him and the peeling paint of the Hastings entryway was violently jarring. Clara froze. The air in her lungs simply stopped. For a wild, insane second, she thought he had come to demand payment for the coat, or perhaps to berate her for fleeing. "Your Grace," she said. Her voice sounded thin, scraping against the damp air. "Miss Hastings." His eyes dropped to the rough apron, then down to her right hand, wrapped in the torn, slightly blood-spotted linen. A muscle in his jaw flexed, a microscopic tightening beneath the skin. "May I come in?" It was framed as a question, but his weight was already shifting forward. Clara stepped back, pulling the door wider. "We do not have a butler, or a fire in the parlor, or tea that isn't primarily dust." "I did not come for tea." He stepped over the threshold. The hallway instantly felt claustrophobic. Clara closed the door, shutting out the staring eyes of the neighborhood. She led him into the front parlor. The room was freezing, smelling of cold ash and mildew. The floral upholstery on the settee was faded to a sickly gray green, and the rug was worn completely bald in the center. Arthur did not sit. He stood in the middle of the room, looking around with a slow, calculating sweep. He didn't look disgusted. He looked like an auditor assessing a ruin. "My aunt is indisposed," Clara said, standing near the unlit hearth. She crossed her arms, tucking her bandaged hand out of sight. "If you have come for your coat, I apologize. I have not yet had the funds to send it to a proper cleaner. The lining—" She swallowed, her throat dry. "The lining is stained." Arthur finally looked at her. His eyes were entirely black in the dim room. "I do not care about the coat." "Then why are you here?" she snapped. The exhaustion was eroding her manners. The adrenaline of last night was gone, leaving only a brittle, hollowed-out shell. "Have you come to see the damage in the daylight? To see how the bankrupt spinsters live?" He didn't flinch. "I came because I made a miscalculation last night." Clara laughed. It was a harsh, scraping sound. "A miscalculation? Yes, I suppose taking off your coat in a ballroom full of the most venomous people in England could be termed a miscalculation." "Not that," Arthur said. his voice dropping into that dark, vibrating register. He took a step closer to her. My error was in leaving you at this door. I acted on impulse. I loathed them, and I saw you bleeding into the marble, and I acted. But in doing so, I didn't shield you, Miss Hastings. I merely painted a target on your back. Clara's breath hitched. She looked away, staring at a chipped porcelain shepherdess on the mantel. She knew he was right. The coat was a shield for the carriage ride, but a death sentence for her reputation. They were already going to ruin me, she said quietly. You just changed the headline. I am aware. Arthur reached into the inner breast pocket of his coat. He pulled out a folded piece of thick, cream-colored vellum. He tossed it onto the small, scratched tea table between them. It landed with a heavy thwack. Which is why I am here to correct the error. Clara looked at the paper, then back at him. What is that? A draft drawn on my bank in the city, Arthur said. It is enough to clear the note Lord Henry's father holds on your family's shipping warehouse. It is also enough to refit your father's last remaining brigantine and provision it for a voyage to the West Indies. The room went entirely silent. The only sound was the frantic ticking of a cheap clock on the wall. Clara's ears rang. The blood rushed out of her head, leaving her dizzy. She stared at the folded paper. It was salvation. It was the answer to 2 years of suffocating, grinding terror. It was her father not going to debtor's prison. It was meat on the table instead of boiled cabbage. She felt a wave of nausea. She looked up at Arthur. Why? Because I broke your dress, he said flatly. You did not break my dress. Lady Genevieve's foot broke my dress. A velvet heel broke my dress. Clara's voice was rising, vibrating with a sudden, violent panic. She stepped back from the table as if the paper were radioactive. You do not buy a man's entire shipping business because you lent his daughter a coat. What do you want, Your Grace? What is the price? Arthur's eyes narrowed. He didn't look offended by her suspicion. He looked entirely satisfied by it. The price, Arthur said, pacing slowly toward the window, blocking out the gray light, is your company. Clara barked a bitter laugh. My company? You want to make me your mistress? I assure you I am too tired, too thin, and entirely too ill-tempered for the role. Don't be absurd, Arthur snapped, turning back to her. The harshness in his voice was genuine. I have no interest in keeping a mistress, least of all a woman who looks at me as though I'm holding a knife to her throat. No, Miss Hastings, I want your company in public. Clara frowned, the panic receding slightly, replaced by deep confusion. I do not understand. Arthur leaned against the window frame. The Ton believes they have broken you. They believe they have put me in my place for daring to flout their unwritten laws. They expect me to retreat to Yorkshire in embarrassment, and they expect you to vanish into the gutters. He paused, his gaze locking onto hers. The sheer gravitational weight of his stare pinned her to the floorboards. I am a petty man, Miss Hastings, Arthur continued slowly. I do not like to lose, and I deeply despise being told what to do by men who inherit their money and women who spend their days gossiping over teacups. I want to walk back into the center of their gilded cage, and I want to spit in their faces. He pointed a long, leather-gloved finger at her. I bought your father's debt. In exchange, you are going to be my weapon. For the remainder of the season, you will be seen on my arm, at the theater, at the park, at the balls. We will let them whisper. We will let them choke on it. You will not hide in this crumbling house. You will wear my patronage like armor, and you will make them regret the day they ever learned your name. The sheer absurdity of the proposition hung in the damp air of the parlor. Clara stared at the Duke of Westford. He wasn't smiling. This wasn't a jest. He was proposing a calculated, deeply cynical alliance based entirely on mutual spite. It was the least romantic proposal in the history of London, and because of that, it was the first thing a man had ever said to her that she actually trusted. You want to use me as a prop, Clara said, testing the weight of the words. A bludgeon to beat society over the head with. Yes, Arthur agreed without a second of hesitation. And if I refuse? Then I pick up that draft, I walk out that door, and tomorrow morning Lord Henry's father forecloses on your warehouse. His voice was void of cruelty. It was simply a statement of architectural fact. You are drowning, Clara. I am offering you a very large, very heavy piece of wood. It may give you splinters, but it will keep your head above water. It was the first time he had used her Christian name. It felt strange on his tongue, rough-hewn and heavy. Clara looked at the cream vellum on the table. She could smell the ink. She closed her eyes. She thought of her father, sitting in his study night after night, rubbing his temples until the skin was raw, terrified of the knock at the door that would bring the bailiffs. She opened her eyes. The fire inside her, the one that had kept her spine straight at the ball, flared to life, burning away the exhaustion. If I agree to this, Clara said, her voice turning hard, flat, and perfectly steady, I will not wear cast-offs. If I am to be your weapon, your grace, I will be polished. I will not be paraded around in mended silk so they can sneer at your charity case. A dark, dangerous gleam flickered in Arthur's eyes. A smile, barely a millimeter of movement at the corner of his mouth, finally broke the severe lines of his face. Agreed, he said. And you will speak to my father regarding the ships. It is a business loan. Drawn against the future profits of the Caribbean run. I'm not a whore, and I do not accept charity. The Hastings name will repay the debt with standard city interest. 5%, Arthur countered. 3, Clara fired back. Arthur's chest rumbled with a suppressed laugh. 4, and I get to choose the tailor who makes your gowns. Clara lifted her chin. I choose the color. Done. Arthur stepped away from the window and walked back to the tea table. He didn't pick up the draft. He left it there. The physical reality of the money sitting in her house made Clara's stomach twist, a violent mixture of profound relief and total terror. She had just sold herself to the devil, but the devil, it turned out, negotiated fair terms. Now, Arthur said, the business concluded, his tone shifting back to the clipped, authoritative register. Where is my coat? Clara stiffened. I told you it is upstairs. I haven't cleaned it. Fetch it. Your Grace, the lining is... I said fetch it, Clara. She glared at him, a spark of pure resentment flashing in her gray eyes. She turned on her heel, her worn boots thudding loudly on the uncarpeted stairs. She marched up to her freezing bedroom. The coat was draped over the chair, exactly as she had left it. She picked it up. It was absurdly heavy. The smell of cedar and rain instantly hit her, bringing back the sensory memory of the dark, rattling carriage and the strange, terrifying safety she had felt inside it. She carried it downstairs, her arms straining slightly under the weight of the dense wool. She walked back into the parlor and held it out to him. Arthur took it. The transfer of the heavy garment from her hands to his forced them to stand very close. Clara could feel the heat radiating off him, battling the damp chill of the parlor. Arthur didn't put the coat on. He draped it over his forearm and casually flipped the lapel back, exposing the interior silver silk lining. Right at the chest, where Clara's hand had clutched the fabric in the carriage, was a smear of dried, rusted brown. Blood. Her blood. Clara flushed, a hot, shameful heat creeping up her neck. I apologize. I will have the money to replace the lining deducted from the loan. Arthur dropped the lapel, hiding the stain. He looked up, his dark eyes locking onto hers. He reached out, his movement slow, deliberate. Clara didn't move. She couldn't. His large, gloved hand hovered in the space between them, and then his thumb gently brushed against the rough, torn linen wrapping her right hand. The touch was feather-light, entirely incongruous with the massive, bruising presence of the man. Does it hurt? He asked, his voice low. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The physical contact sent a jolt of static electricity up her arm. Only when I have to scrub the pans, she whispered, her defensive armor cracking for just a fraction of a second. Leave the pans, Arthur said. You have a war to prepare for. I will send my carriage for you on Thursday next. We are attending the opera. He didn't say goodbye. He turned, the heavy coat draped over his arm, and walked out the front door. Clara listened to the heavy, echoing thud of the wood closing, followed by the cracking of the coachman's whip and the rumble of wheels on the cobblestones. She stood alone in the freezing parlor, staring at the cream vellum on the table, rubbing her thumb where the ghost of his touch still burned. 2 weeks later, the atmosphere inside the King's Theatre was thick enough to cut with a silver blade. It smelled of melting wax, hot perfume, and the sharp metallic tang of anticipating a slaughter. The gossip had been a living, breathing monster in Mayfair. The Duke of Westford had bought the Hastings debt. The Duke of Westford was seen taking tea with the ruined spinster. The Duke of Westford had lost his mind. Clara stood in the shadowy vestibule outside the private boxes, listening to the dull roar of the crowd taking their seats. She didn't feel like a fairy tale princess. She felt like a soldier standing on the edge of a trench. Arthur had kept his word. The dressmaker had arrived the day after his visit, bearing bolts of fabric that cost more than Clara's house. Clara had refused the pastels, the delicate laces, the fluttering ribbons. Tonight, she wore black. It wasn't the dull, dusty black of morning. It was midnight. Black velvet, so thick and rich it seemed to swallow the light around it. The gown was devoid of frills. It was architectural. The bodice was cut low, severe and sharp, fitting her like a second skin. The sleeves were long and tight. The skirt fell in heavy statuesque folds. Around her neck sat a single blood-red ruby pendant, borrowed from the Westford vaults, Arthur had dryly informed her. She looked terrifying. She looked magnificent. Arthur stood beside her. He was in full formal evening wear, a stark black tailcoat that mirrored her gown, a snowy white cravat, and a diamond pin at his throat. He looked like an executioner. "Are you breathing?" Arthur asked, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the velvet curtain separating them from the box. "Barely," Clara admitted. Her stomach was a cold, tight knot. "If I trip tonight, Your Grace, I assure you the velvet will not tear. If you trip tonight, I will burn the theater to the ground to distract them," Arthur said deadpan. He offered his arm. Clara looked at the black sleeve. The memory of his heavy coat settling over her shaking shoulders rushed back. She placed her hand on his arm. Her palm, newly healed and unbandaged, felt the hard, dense muscle beneath the wool. "Let us go," Clara said. A footman pulled back the heavy curtain. Arthur and Clara stepped into the Duke of Westford's private box. It was situated dead center, the most prominent position in the house. The effect was instantaneous. It started in the boxes immediately adjacent. A sudden, sharp cessation of voices. Heads turned. Opera glasses were raised. The silence rippled outward, cascading down to the pit and up to the galleries. Within 30 seconds, the low roar of 400 people had been reduced to a tense, suffocating hush. Every eye in the theater was on the bankrupt spinster and the untouchable Duke. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. The urge to shrink back, to hide in the shadows of the box, was overwhelming. She gripped Arthur's arm tighter, her fingernails biting into the wool. Arthur didn't pull away. He stepped forward, bringing her to the very edge of the balustrade, right into the punishing glare of the gas lights. He looked down at the crowd. His expression was a masterclass in contempt. He swept his gaze over the stalls, meeting the eyes of the men who had laughed at her, the women who had whispered behind their fans. He didn't sneer. He just looked at them, as if they were a particularly disappointing breed of livestock. Clara followed his gaze. She saw Lady Genevieve in a box opposite them, wearing a pale yellow silk that suddenly looked insipid and childish against Clara's black velvet. Genevieve's mouth was slightly open, her fan frozen halfway to her face. Sitting beside her was Lord Henry, his face flushed a dull, ugly red. Clara stopped shrinking. The heat radiating from Arthur's solid frame beside her seeped into her bones. He had given her the armor, but she had to be the one to wear it. She lifted her chin. She let her gaze slide over Genevieve, holding the woman's eyes for 3 agonizing seconds, letting her face remain perfectly, coldly blank. Genevieve looked away first, snapping her fan shut with a frantic rustle. A dark, thrumming thrill of power rushed through Clara's veins. It was intoxicating. It was dangerous. "You see?" Arthur murmured, his lips barely moving, his voice meant only for her. "They are nothing but sheep, and sheep are terrified of wolves." The orchestra struck up the overture. The music shattered the silence, forcing the crowd to turn back to the stage, though Clara could feel the weight of hundreds of sideways glances remaining locked on their box. Arthur stepped back from the balustrade, gesturing to the velvet-cushioned chair. Clara sat. The heavy skirt settled perfectly around her. Arthur took the chair beside her. They didn't speak for the entire first act. The tension in the box was a living thing, thick and electrical. Clara was acutely aware of every breath he took, the slight rustle of his broadcloth, the scent of cedar that cut through the cloying perfume of the theater. When the intermission arrived, the doors to their box opened. It was expected that visitors would come to pay their respects to the Duke. But tonight, the threshold was a battleground. To enter the box was to acknowledge Clara Hastings. To acknowledge her was to admit defeat. The first to arrive was an older marquis, a business associate of Arthur's. He stepped in, completely ignoring the scandal, and bowed to Clara. "Miss Hastings, you look formidable this evening," the old man said, his eyes twinkling with suppressed amusement. "Thank you, Lord Thomas," Clara replied, her voice steady. Then came the true test. Lord Henry, propelled forward by what could only be a desperate need to save face, hovered at the doorway. He looked sweaty. The powder on his face was caking. "Westford," Henry stammered. "A fine performance." He turned to Clara, forcing a sickly, tight-lipped smile. "Miss Hastings, I see you have recovered from your unfortunate accident at Richmond's." Arthur stood up. He didn't move fast. He unfolded his large frame slowly, dominating the small space of the box. He stepped between Clara and Lord Henry. "Accident, Henry?" Arthur said. The word was a razor blade wrapped in a velvet. "I was under the impression it was an assault by a clumsy, ill-bred woman who lacked the grace to control her own feet. But perhaps your eyesight is as poor as your tailor." Henry blanched. He opened his mouth, closed it, and took a physical step backward. I meant no offense." "Then you should learn to speak less," Arthur said softly. "Now, get out of my box. You smell of cheap gin." Henry practically tripped over his own feet, fleeing into the corridor. Arthur turned back to Clara. The cold, brutal mask vanished the moment he looked at her. He sat back down. Clara was staring at him. The protective rage he had just displayed wasn't part of the contract. The contract was to be seen. He had just actively publicly humiliated a peer to defend her honor. "You didn't have to do that," Clara whispered, the velvet of her dress rustling as she leaned toward him. "The arrangement was just for show." Arthur looked at her. The gaslight caught the sharp angle of his cheekbone. He reached out, not hesitating this time. He took her hand, the one that had been bleeding 2 weeks ago. He didn't wear gloves in the box. His skin was hot against hers. His thumb stroked the back of her knuckles. "The arrangement," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating right through the floorboards into her boots, "was to make them regret the day they learned your name. I am simply ensuring the lesson is thorough." Clara looked down at their joined hands, the black velvet of her sleeve against the dark broadcloth of his coat. Two dark, heavy things pressed together in the light. She looked back up at his face. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the deep-seated cynicism that matched her own, and beneath it all, a fierce, terrifying loyalty that she had never expected to find in this miserable, gilded world. She wasn't a charity case anymore, and she wasn't just a weapon. She turned her hand over, lacing her fingers through his. His grip tightened, locking them together with a bruising, desperate strength. They sat in silence, ignoring the stage, ignoring the hundreds of eyes burning holes into their backs. Let the ton whisper. Let them rot. Clara had finally found her armor, and it was entirely, wonderfully bulletproof. And that is how you burn a toxic society to the ground, not with tears, but with black velvet, a bought ledger, and a duke who knows exactly how to wield his silence like a knife. Clara and Arthur proved that the strongest alliances aren't built on fairy tale romance. They're forged in spite, survival, and a refusal to be broken. If this gritty, defiant love story kept you hooked, don't let it end here. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a truly ruthless romance, and subscribe to the channel for more deeply human historical dramas. Tell me in the comments, what was your favorite moment of revenge? See you in the next story.